Hey, we are back, ready
Yes.
for another reading and commentary about what's Black Love got to do with it. If you do not have your free resource, please right now go to
WeBuildLegacy.com. Thank you for going to WeBuildLegacy.com. And don't forget to also go to our YouTube page, We Build Legacy.
Yeah.
Yes.
And make sure you subscribe because every time one of these comes out, you'll be notified and you'll be able to see it. Today, we're talking about Eurocentric practices influence on Black couples. And we have to know there has been great influence on us. And from our entrapment to our being um, trafficked here across the water and all those things. There are things we all know that there are things we've lost, there are things that have been stolen, abandoned, and forgotten. We all know that. But there has been a great influence on our relationships. So we want to look specifically at how Eurocentric practices influenced our couple relationships. Okay. All right. See you on the other side.
Eurocentric practices influence on Black couples. The origins of the marriage practices in the United States are important to consider in order to understand the practices and principles upon which many people base their relationship expectations. It is also important to acknowledge that for centuries, the marriage unions and partnerships of enslaved Africans and their descendants were not acknowledged. For hundreds of years, Black romantic partnerships and family structures were disregarded and not legally recognized by the United States government as authentic marriages. Oppressed people of African descent understood that their commitment to each other could not be based on the definitions promoted or condoned by their oppressors. They created their own marriage ceremonies based on the practices that were significant to them based on their traditions. These Africans who had lost autonomy over their very bodies understood fully that they would have to be creative if they were to ensure that children who were left behind would be cared for if parents were sold away. They knew how to create family quickly with those who arrived suddenly in strange new locations. And whether those that oppressed them acknowledged their romantic partnerships or not, those relationships were legitimate. And they worked together to endure and hold on to their relationships, even when their men were used for breeding and their women were raped and forced to bear their oppressors' children. Since the Civil Rights era, when African Americans' citizenship was recognized and laws were changed to support integration, there has been a continued effort toward assimilation in many areas of the lives of African Americans. This includes their romantic partnerships. Some African Americans who followed certain religious traditions looked toward the marriage traditions and gender roles practiced in the majority culture as a roadmap because it was aligned with their spiritual beliefs. To some, if they were able to function in the same manner as white families were shown to function, in their power dynamics, masculine and feminine expressions, economic, educational, employment achievements, and domestic roles and responsibilities, then that would be evidence that they had been fully embraced as citizens in the United States who could achieve the American dream. In an interview with Harry Belafonte, Martin Luther King Jr. is quoted as saying, "I have come to believe that we are integrating into a burning house." While that statement was to acknowledge deeper needs of the civil rights movement to address economic freedom, It is also aptly described the situation that was occurring in other contexts of American culture at the time. For example, while Black people were fighting for civil rights, many women from the majority culture, including some women of color, were fighting for women's rights and freedoms. These women were marching as well and burning their bras to protest the structures that supported women's subjugation to men in power, freedom of expression, economic, educational, employment achievements, and domestic roles and responsibilities. They were protesting beliefs that suggested that women needed permission from their husbands for simple tasks, such as owning a credit card. Moreover, women who wanted to leave dangerous marriage situations were required to prove the faults of their husbands to a system that considered disciplining a wife as acceptable as disciplining a child. Stated another way, they were fighting laws that suggested that there was only one way for a man and a woman to function alongside one another in society and in romantic partnership. Many African Americans who chose to try to assimilate into the majority culture by imitating gender roles of marriage were literally integrating into a burning house. The oppressive ideals and structures that upheld them had already begun to burn, and they had already been shown to be unsustainable and unsuitable for a society that claimed freedom and equality for all of its citizens.
Wow. That's a lot to unpack. I actually don't know where to start, but I'm going to just go ahead and jump in because so many things came to mind. I guess I'll just jump into, what I guess really took me back is that when you're thinking about a lot of the laws that were put in place as we came or we were brought into this situation as enslaved Africans, and after the time when civil rights started to come into place and Jim Crow, so many different, different changes when you talk about, integration and assimilation. That the time where it says, for example, while many Black people were fighting for civil rights, many women from the majority culture, including some women of color, were fighting for women's rights and freedoms. These women were marching as well and burning their bras to protest the structures that supported women's subjugation to men in power. So my question is that how did it switch from the degradation of humans' rights to now fighting for women's rights? And I guess that kind of hits hard because the focus from a person being identified as a human, but now here comes even more or equal standard of, hey, what about us as women needing to be represented in this particular place? And so this is a great segue that comes out of the beginning when we're talking about the context of marriage, the context of the historical structure of this European Western ideology of laws and rules, and not really considered in the context of relationships as we would probably know it from our indigenous ancestors in Africa. But now, this new type of relationship that's established between, I guess, the monarch or the man and the woman, and it hadn't even at least it wasn't of any importance of talking about the right and the human right of the Black African.
But that's one of those things that if you go back 100 years ago from now, and all these things, suffrage and the right to vote for women, and when we had all of the Susan B. Anthony's, and when we talk about the Sojourner Truths and all of our there's always been this situation where people seem to have to want to choose between whether we're going to look for the human rights of people of African descent to be treated as human,
mm-hmm.
and then other things come up, and it's always, for whatever reason, been juxtaposed, like right there, aligned with women's rights. Anytime you go back in history, you're going to see it. You're going to see that when that popped up, when it was the abolitionists, they were like, those that were standing against slavery and the enslavement of Black people, the women's suffrage. Wait a minute now, before y'all trying to give these Black men a right to vote, because they have penises too, okay? Before you give them a right, we are white women. We deserve that right first. And there are all kinds of quotes. You can go and look and see what some of these, people, first wave of feminists and second waves of feminists and different ones have done. And I understand nowadays there's so many different ways that people identify themselves. But when it comes down to it, a lot of these movements have stood side by side. I know one of the things that really stood out to me was just the whole context of, at the very beginning, talking about not being recognized as authentic, our relationships.
I wanted to touch on that too. I jumped into the middle, but go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I wanted to read that part. It said the marriage union and partnerships of enslaved Africans and their descendants were not acknowledged. For hundreds of years, Black romantic partnerships and family structures were disregarded and not legally recognized by the U.S. government as authentic relationships. And we go on, and there's other things to capture, but just even right there, when we're talking about Black love and the relationships between a man and a woman of African descent, and we look to adopt certain principles and certain behaviors from other cultures, I guess one of the challenges is that if you're going to do that or even consider that, why not start by your indigenous culture, your indigenous religion? Because in this particular context, you weren't even seen as equal or human. But now we not only look to this particular Eurocentric idea, but we've adopted it as our own.
Exactly.
Like this is where
rejected.
Wow.
And rejected what comes from our own context.
Right.
We rejected it.
And that's, I guess, that's why we talk about Sankofa so much, about not forgetting the things that were lost, but going back
forward.
Yeah, going back to retrieve those things which are lost, stolen, and forgotten, and regaining that understanding about relationships as in the context from our ancestry.
Exactly.
Where we were considered kings and queens. Yes. And I don't want to go too far.
No, but it was one of those things where what I see, I work in birth work and other things, and the context, that whole context of our relationships not being authentic. Do you know how many women, including myself, when I was having babies, there are so many women who say, when I went in the hospital, they'll see you there, but they'll be like, "Is this your baby's daddy?" How dare you? How dare you? The man that I bring in with me, you assume. Now, think about these contexts of birth and everything else. Women's fingers swell up. She might not have any rings on her finger or anything like that. All kinds of things. But they're going to refer to their baby's dad as opposed to, is this your partner? Is this your husband? Is this your whomever? Is this your baby's daddy? It's a disregard and it's a disrespect for our unions. However, they situate. There is no respect for this thing right here.
Talk about it.
And that has never changed. And I'm getting excited. I'm trying to calm down. But one of the reasons why I get so passionate about it is, I have a friend that always talks about things working to your highest good. If there are things that do not serve your highest good, when will you change as an autonomous, free thinking, critically thinking, questioning person? When will you change what you do and decide, wait a minute, this is not working out best for me?
And so we have to see that these particular ideas and thought patterns that have, I guess, bum rushed our perspective and ideology and our world perspective, have really um, um, just, Andrea uses in her research the cognitive dissonance, trying to live out something
that's also
not
in the
feeling,
intro.
yeah, that's
Go
not
back
feeling,
and listen to the intro.
that's not a part of your nature. I'm kind of thinking of some other things that actually worked. Didn't work in our favor as a young Black couple because we spent so much time trying to assimilate into ideas and thoughts and patterns that really didn't come natural, not only from Africa, but even from an African American standpoint. When you think about working in the household,
exactly.
There were times when my wife was looked at and looked down upon because she was homeschooling our children, because she didn't, I guess, look like or fit into a particular
No, they said it
compartment.
clearly. They said, oh, white people do that. We don't do that. I got called all kinds of names because we were doing what was best and served our highest good, because we wanted a certain foundation for our children. And we kept having these beautiful little Black boys.
And that's the same thing to keep in the context. And when you consider how you start and pattern your relationship and the words that you're using, the actual foundation that you're coming from, when you're talking about, certain things like, oh, I'm the head, I'm responsible for taking care of you. That is my job. That is my role. Well, where did you get that from? And how did that, more or less, that idea and that thought come into being into your relationship? And
see, because you're saying it and they don't have a context, and of course I do talk about it, but part of it, if you get if you go to webuildlegacy.com and look at it, I don't know if they can see it, but you'll see.
Yes, you need to take a look.
You need to let me cover it up. There you go.
Right.
You need to see that.
That's on page 20.
On page 20, you'll know more about what he's talking about.
Right.
We were in a lot of situations where it sounds really beautiful, say you're the head, you take care of, but there were all kinds of lording over and coverage. If you looked at the last video, that was included in that talk.
A lot of those power dynamics.
That's what it was.
Actually, I don't know if confused is the right word, but I think it threw in a lot of curveballs into young African couples' relationship, especially in a certain dispensation, because here it is now, you're having even more women that Black women who were getting their postgraduate degrees, were making money.
Well, let me say this: we always were the ones doing that.
Most definitely, but I was just saying even more as we start going even more in the future, because Black men were being,
what I'm told from my family and even from my research, often the women were teachers and nurses and things like that. They were being sent to school to be able to do that, and the men, like with the Booker T. Washington and all of those, they were working.
But we were still working out of those contexts of head of household, and while they may have context, in certain situations, I loved in your research how you pointed out different archetypes and power structures. We were actually pent into, in my understanding, from what we came from, was we were kind of relating out of one power structure and not considering other power structures as it related to this new way that we were looking at the power dynamics in our relationships.
Yeah, it wasn't growing with us, and I think we should stop here for this one, because you know what the whole thing says, and I'm like trying. I'm not gonna say that. I'm not gonna. He's like jumped ahead to like sections all the way whenever, but I think we should stop here simply because I didn't even get to my point about assimilation.
Please,
but we're gonna, that comes up. Okay. I wrote about it.
Did you want to say a little bit?
No, we'll go here because so the video doesn't get too long. But just knowing that there's a lot of deconstructing that needs to be done. There's a lot that we need to unpack. so that we can be at our highest good for each other. And just to spoil it for you at the end, there is no right way or wrong way that we're suggesting. If you get the download and you go to the end of it, you'll see that we're just trying to help you figure out what works best for you and see your particular way of interacting. And then if you have a partner, consider, are we compatible like this? Do we see these things the same? And if not, when you go looking for your partner, you can ask certain questions that'll get you there. So stick with us, guys. We're talking about some stuff.
That's right.
Stick with us.
Please make sure that you go ahead and go to webuildlegacy.com to download your free resource, What's Black Love Got to Do with It, so that you can follow along with us as we continue to go on through the next section. Thank you so much.
See you in a minute.